Hey there! Tonight, we're drifting back to a time when rules weren't written in employee handbooks or posted on break room walls, but carved into the rhythm of daily life. Rules so old, so woven into the fabric of society, that we still follow them today without knowing why. From the hand you used to shake with strangers, to the way you wait your turn at the coffee shop, to the colors you wear to a funeral, medieval customs are everywhere, quietly shaping your modern life in ways you've never noticed. If this kind of storytelling helps you unwind, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it actually brings you peace. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. It's strangely comforting to know who else is out there, drifting off to the same quiet history. So settle in, let the past whisper its old rules, and let's begin. Section 1. The left hand's long shadow. You probably don't think twice about which hand you use to write, eat, or shake hands with a stranger. But if you were born left-handed in medieval Europe, that simple biological fact could mark you as suspicious, sinful, or even dangerous. The prejudice against left-handedness runs deeper than you might imagine, and its echoes still linger in the tools you use, the words you speak, and the rituals you perform. It starts with language. The Latin word for left is sinister. Yes, that's sinister, the one that means evil, threatening, ominous. The word for right, meanwhile, is dexter, which gives us dexterity, meaning skill and grace. From the very roots of Western language, left was coded as wrong, and right as, well, right. This wasn't just linguistic coincidence. It reflected a worldview that saw the left side as fundamentally lesser, morally suspect, spiritually compromised. In medieval Christianity, the symbolism was everywhere. God's right hand was the hand of blessing, mercy, salvation. The righteous sat at the right hand of God. At the last judgment, the saved would stand on God's right side, while the damned were cast to the left into eternal fire. Church architecture reinforced this constantly. The blessed had entered through the right door, while the left was associated with shadow and exclusion. Medieval artists painted devils with their left hands extended, witches stirring cauldrons counterclockwise with left-handed spoons. This wasn't just symbolic. It had real consequences. Left-handed children in medieval households were corrected, sometimes gently, often not. Teachers tied left hands behind backs or struck them with rods. Parents bound the left hand to force reliance on the right. The logic, drawn from scripture and tradition, held that the left hand was the devil's hand, and to favor was to invite corruption. Based on what we know of medieval educational practices and religious instruction, this correction would have been seen not as cruelty, but as moral duty saving a child from a dangerous inclination. Guild regulations sometimes specified that apprentices work with their right hands. Tournament rules in some regions prohibited left-handed jousting. Though the reasons given varied, some claimed it gave an unfair advantage. Others that it violated the proper order of combat. When a knight extended his right hand in greeting, it signaled peaceful intent. The left hand, by contrast, carried connotations of deception or hidden threat, which may help explain why handshake customs favored the right so strongly. The consequences weren't always severe, but they were persistent. A left-handed scribe might be reassigned to other tasks. A left-handed child might be viewed with mild suspicion by neighbors. The degree of enforcement varied by region, family, and era, but the underlying assumption remained consistent. Left-handedness was something to overcome, not accommodate. This bias wasn't unique to Christianity. Islamic tradition reserved the left hand for unclean tasks, personal hygiene after using the latrine, and the right hand for eating, greeting, giving gifts. To offer your left hand or accept food with it was deeply insulting. This practice, rooted in practical hygiene concerns of the pre-modern world, became ritualized into religious law and social custom, and it persists in many cultures today. Fast forward to the modern world, and you still live in a right-handed universe. Scissors, can openers, computer mice, school desks with attached writing surfaces on the right side. spiral notebooks that dig into your wrist if you write left-handed, the buttons on shirts, the layout of keyboards all designed for right-handed people. This isn't malice. It's simply that roughly 90% of the population is right-handed, and design follows the majority. But the deeper legacy is linguistic and psychological. We still say someone has 2 left feet to mean clumsiness. A left-handed compliment is an insult disguised as praise. Something that feels sinister carries that old Latin shadow. When you shake hands, you extend your right hand without thinking, partly for practical reasons. Yes, but also because centuries of custom have made the right hand the hand of greeting, trust, and civility. Even the handshake itself, that universal gesture of introduction and agreement, carries the assumption of right-handedness. When 2 left-handed people meet and awkwardly try to shake with their dominant hands, they're briefly disrupting a pattern set long ago, when right was right and left was not. The persecution of left-handers eased gradually, not through sudden enlightenment, but through slow social change. By the 20th century, forced correction became less common, though it persisted in some Catholic schools into the 1970s, where nuns wrapped left-handed students' knuckles with rulers. The language of demonic association faded, replaced by a more clinical approach. Left-handedness was seen as a neurological quirk, sometimes linked to learning difficulties or developmental concerns, though these theories have largely been debunked. Today, left-handedness is accepted, even celebrated. Left-handed specialty stores sell adapted tools. Famous left-handers Leonardo da Vinci, Barack Obama, Paul McCartney prove that the left hand carries no curse. But the medieval world's assumption that right is normal and left is other still structures your daily experience in small, nearly invisible ways. So the next time you pick up a pair of scissors or shake someone's hand, remember, you're participating in a custom that once marked the boundary between blessed and suspect, between righteous and sinister. Medieval rules don't always announce themselves. Sometimes they just fit so naturally into your grip that you never think to question them. Section 2. The handshake's hidden history. You meet a stranger. You extend your right hand. They grasp it. You shake once, maybe twice. You release. The entire interaction takes seconds, and you've done it so many times you don't even think about it. But that simple gesture palm to palm, right hand to right hand, has a long and somewhat murky history that reaches back through medieval custom, ancient practice, and possibly even prehistoric gesture. The most popular origin story, the one you've probably heard, goes like this. In an age when everyone carried weapons, extending an open right hand showed you held no blade. The handshake was a peace signal, a way of saying, "Look, I'm unarmed." Some versions add that the up and down shaking motion was meant to dislodge any hidden daggers from sleeves. It's a compelling narrative, practical and vivid. The problem is, like many compelling narratives, it's hard to verify. Ancient Greek and Roman art shows people clasping hands, yes, often in context of agreement, alliance, or farewell. But these weren't casual greetings. They were formal, ritualized gestures marking significant moments. A 5th century BC Greek relief shows 2 soldiers clasping hands, likely sealing an oath or treaty. A Roman coin depicts the handshake as a symbol of Concordia, the goddess of harmony and agreement. These were symbolic acts, not everyday hellos. In medieval Europe, the evidence for handshakes as routine greetings is surprisingly thin. Some scholars argue that what we think of as the handshake, a brief, informal clasp upon meeting, didn't become common until the 17th or even 18th century. Before that, greetings varied by status and region. Bows, curtsies, kisses, removal of hats. A 15th century German visitor to England noted that the English kissed in greeting where others might shake hands, suggesting that handshaking wasn't yet universal even in the late medieval period. That said, medieval people did clasp hands in specific contexts. Handfasting, for example, was a marriage custom where couples joined right hands in front of witnesses to seal their betrothal or wedding vows. This wasn't a greeting. It was a binding contract, a physical symbol of union and agreement. The clasped hands represented the joining of two families, two estates, sometimes two political alliances. The gesture mattered because it was witnessed and remembered. Knights and nobles also clasped hands when swearing oaths of fealty or making treaties. A lord and vassal might join hands as the vassal pledged loyalty. Two nobles making peace might clasp hands publicly to signal the end of a conflict. These gestures carried weight breaking such an agreement was breaking a bond made tangible by touch. Now, here's where the weapon theory could have some merit, though in a more limited way than the popular version suggests. In contexts where trust was uncertain, meeting a stranger on the road, negotiating a truce, entering a potentially hostile hall offering your weapon hand empty could indeed signal peaceful intent. And the practice of gripping not just the hand but the forearm, common in Roman times and possibly into the medieval period, would make it harder to draw a concealed blade. But this wasn't a universal greeting. It was a situational precaution, used when the stakes were high and trust was low. By the medieval tournament, elaborate rituals governed knightly conduct. Before a joust, knights might clasp hands briefly as a gesture of respect and fair play, signaling that the combat, though fierce, was bound by rules and honor. Refusing to shake could be seen as an insult, a suggestion that your opponent wasn't worthy of courtesy. This could imply that even in formalized violence, the handshake served as a boundary marker, a way of saying, we may fight, but we acknowledge each other as equals under a shared code. The right hand's dominance in handshakes ties back to that medieval left hand suspicion. Offering your right hand was offering your sword hand, your oath hand, your clean hand. The left hand, by contrast, carried those old associations, less trustworthy, less honorable. So even if the handshake's origins aren't precisely about weapon checking, the choice of hand absolutely reflects medieval hierarchies of purity and propriety. By the time the handshake became a common greeting likely popularized by the 17th century Quakers, who saw it as more egalitarian than bowing or doffing hats, the gesture had absorbed all these layers of meaning. It wasn't just, I'm not armed. It was, I recognize you as an equal. I'm making a commitment. I'm signaling trust. The simplicity of the modern handshake hides its complexity. Today, you shake hands to greet, to seal deals, to congratulate, to introduce yourself at a job interview. You're taught from childhood how to shake properly. Firm grip, eye contact, 2 or 3 pumps, not too tight, not too limp. Etiquette guides still devote pages to the handshake's subtleties. A weak handshake suggests timidity. A crushing one suggests aggression. You can apparently be judged on your handshake before you've said a single word, and it's still a test of trust. When someone refuses to shake your hand, it stings. It signals rejection, suspicion, hostility. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the sudden disappearance of handshakes left a strange social vacuum. People bumped elbows or waved awkwardly, searching for a replacement gesture that carried the same weight. The handshake, it turned out, wasn't just a relic. It was still doing work, still signaling things words couldn't quite convey. So when you extend your hand to a stranger today, you're performing a gesture that might date back to ancient oaths, medieval contracts, or early modern egalitarian ideals, or possibly all of the above, layered together like sediment. You're saying, I'm not a threat. Yes, but also, I acknowledge you. I'm entering into social contract with you. I'm offering you trust, and I expect it in return. Medieval customs didn't vanish. They evolved, absorbed new meanings, traveled across centuries and continents. And now, in the briefest clasp of 2 right hands, they're still there, quietly shaping how you greet the world. Section 3. The invention of the line. You stand in line at the coffee shop. You wait your turn at the post office. You queue up for concert tickets, driver's license renewals, airport security. Standing in an orderly line, waiting patiently for your turn, feels natural, even inevitable. But it's not. The organized queue, where the first to arrive is the first to be served, is not an ancient human instinct. It's a relatively recent invention, and its roots, surprisingly, don't reach as far back into the medieval period as you might expect. The first written description of people standing in an orderly line appears in 1837 in Thomas Carlyle's History of the French Revolution. Describing Parisian bread shortages, he wrote about queues, or tails, long strings of people arranged so that the first to arrive would be served first. Carlyle treated this as a curious French custom, something unusual enough to warrant explanation. This suggests that even in the early 19th century, the formal queue wasn't yet universal. But absence of written description doesn't mean absence of practice. Medieval people certainly waited for bread at the baker's, for justice at the manor court, for entry into crowded churches on feast days. The question is, how did they wait? Medieval markets were chaotic, crowded spaces. Vendors shouted to attract customers. Buyers pushed forward to inspect goods, haggle over prices, claim the best items before others could. In most cases, this appears to have been a free-for-all, a scramble where assertiveness, loud voices, and quick hands won the day. The idea of an orderly line, where everyone patiently awaited their turn, would have seemed strange, even wasteful. Why wait when you could simply push forward? However, there's evidence that some form of organized waiting did exist in specific medieval contexts, even if it wasn't the tidy queue we know today. Monasteries, with their emphasis on discipline and order, may have had systems for distributing alms to the poor, though records are sparse. The monastic culture of rule following suggests that some structure would have governed who received aid and when. The poor waiting for charity would likely have been organized in some fashion, perhaps by the monks themselves to prevent chaos and ensure fairness. Medieval wells in some towns had regulations about who could draw water and when. During droughts or in crowded urban areas, fights over water access could turn deadly. Town records from places like Bruges and London show occasional regulations requiring people to wait their turn at communal water sources, though how strictly this was enforced is unclear. These early attempts at organized waiting were driven by necessity when resources were scarce and tempers short. Some form of order prevented violence. Similarly, some medieval courts and administrative offices may have used token systems or scheduling to manage the flow of people seeking justice or conducting official business. A bailiff might call names from a list, or people might be told to return at a specific hour. This wasn't queuing in the modern sense, but it was a recognition that uncontrolled crowding created problems and that fairness required some system beyond whoever shouts loudest wins. The medieval period also saw the development of courtesy literature books instructing nobles and wealthy townspeople on proper behavior. While these rarely mentioned queuing explicitly, they did emphasize patience, yielding to one's betters, and not pushing rudely through crowds. The implication was that a civilized person didn't simply shove their way forward, but this was class-specific advice, aimed at people whose status meant they rarely had to wait in the first place. What we do know is that by the 18th and 19th centuries, as cities grew and population swelled, the lack of organized queuing became a serious problem. Bread riots erupted when hungry crowds stormed bakeries with no system to determine who got served. Theater stampedes killed people when everyone rushed the doors at once. The Industrial Revolution, with its factory shifts and mass transit and rationed goods, created situations where large numbers of people needed to be processed efficiently. The queue emerged not from moral enlightenment, but from practical necessity. It was a crowd-control technology. The British, in particular, embraced queuing as a civic virtue, especially during the World Wars when rationing made waiting in line a daily reality. Queuing up became a symbol of British orderliness, patience, and fairness, a way of demonstrating that even in hardship, civilization persisted. To cut in line was to betray not just the individual you wronged, but the collective social contract. George Orwell, writing in the 1940s, marveled at the British willingness to form queues, treating it as a national characteristic. Today, you internalize queue etiquette without thinking. You automatically scan for the end of the line when you enter a store. You feel a flush of indignation when someone cuts. You understand that the queue is a social contract. I wait my turn, you wait yours. And the system rewards patience, not aggression. Skipping ahead, even by accident, triggers immediate social censure. People will call you out, glare, mutter complaints. The queue has even gone digital. You wait in virtual lines for customer service calls, numbered tickets at the deli counter, online waiting rooms for concert tickets. The principle remains: first come, first served, fairness through order. And when the system breaks down, when someone cuts, when the line stalls, when it's unclear where the line ends, the frustration you feel is real, visceral, because the queue has become a moral system, not just a practical one. So while medieval people certainly waited, and may have had informal systems for managing turns in specific contexts, the orderly, universal queue is a more recent development. The rule you follow today: stand in line, wait your turn. Don't cut emerged from industrial-era crowd control and was refined into a deeply internalized social norm. You're not following a medieval rule, exactly. You're following a rule that emerged to manage the medieval chaos. A rule that said, there's a better way to distribute scarce resources than shoving. And that rule, barely 2 centuries old in its modern form, now feels as ancient and immutable as gravity. Section 4. Surnames. The tax collector's gift. You have a surname, a family name. It identifies you, connects you to your ancestors, appears on legal documents and credit cards and coffee cup orders. You likely don't think much about its surnames, or just how people are named. But surnames, as we know them, fixed, inherited, legally binding, are a medieval European invention, born from a specific administrative need: taxation. In the early medieval period, most people had only one name. If you lived in a small village where everyone knew everyone, that was enough. You were John, or Emma, or Cuthbert. If clarification was needed, you might be identified by your father John, son of William, or your location Emma from the mill, or your trade Cuthbert the blacksmith. But these were descriptive tags, not permanent family names. John's son might not be called son of John. He'd get his own descriptor based on his own circumstances. As populations grew and towns expanded, this system broke down. By the 11th and 12th centuries, administrative record-keeping was becoming more sophisticated. Kings and lords needed to track who owed what taxes, military service, feudal obligations. The church needed to record baptisms, marriages, deaths. But when half the men in a town were named John and a quarter were named William, how did you keep them straight? The solution was surname secondary names that became fixed and passed down through generations. England's Domesday Book of 1086, a massive survey of landholdings compiled for tax purposes, shows the beginning of this shift. Many people are still listed with just a single name, but occupational and locational descriptors are becoming more common. William the Baker, Robert of Yorkshire. By the 13th and 14th centuries, European authorities began actively encouraging or requiring the adoption of hereditary surnames for administrative efficiency. Tax rolls needed consistent names. Legal disputes required clear identification of parties. Inheritance laws demanded certainty about family lines. Surnames became legally useful, then legally mandatory. The most common types of medieval surnames reflected how people were actually identified in daily life. Occupational surnames came from trades: smith, miller, baker, cooper, carpenter, fletcher, arrowmaker, thatcher, mason. These were practical identifiers. If you needed a blacksmith, you looked for the Smith family. These names were so useful they appeared across Europe in various languages. Schmidt in German, Lefebvre in French, Kowalski in Polish, all mean smith. Patronymic surnames came from fathers' names: Johnson, Johnson, Richardson, Peterson. In Scandinavia, This pattern persisted longer, Ericsson, Anderson, with the son or sen suffix. In Ireland and Scotland, Mac or Matt son of MacDonald, McGregor. In Wales, AP served the same function, AP Rees becoming Price, AP Hugh becoming Pooh. Locational surnames came from geography, hill, woods, rivers, York, Kent, Lincoln. If your family came from a specific manor or estate, you might take that name. Robert the Barclay became Robert Barclay. De or of gradually dropped away, leaving just a place name. Descriptive surnames came from physical characteristics or personal qualities. Short, long, strong, hardy, good, sharp. Some were flattering, others, presumably, less so. White or black might refer to hair or complexion. Brown was common, though its original meaning is debated. Nickname surnames were more whimsical or specific. Fox, cunning, wolf, fierce, bird, swift, or even Goodnow, self-explanatory. Some preserved unusual characteristics. Crookshank, bent leg, blackbeard, redhead. Once established, surnames became inherited property. Your surname connected you to a lineage, a reputation, a place in the social order. The Smith family might have stopped smithing 3 generations ago, but the name persisted, carrying ancestral memory in its syllables. Surnames also reinforced social hierarchy. Nobles often had locational surnames linked to their estates, signaling landholding and status. Peasants had occupational or descriptive surnames, marking them as laborers. You could guess someone's class by their name. Sir William de Warwick was clearly noble. John Miller clearly was not. The permanence of surnames created new problems. What happened when a family's circumstances changed? If the Smith family stopped smithing and became bakers, they still carried the Smith name, now inaccurate. If a family moved away from Yorkshire, they might still be called York generations later. Surnames became historical artifacts, preserving information about ancestors while revealing nothing about the current generation. Over time, surnames became more than administrative tools. They became identity. Your surname connected you to cousins, ancestors, a sense of belonging. Heraldic devices and coats of arms were tied to surnames, creating visual representations of family identity. Genealogy became possible because surnames provided continuity across generations. Today, you inherit your surname at birth, and it follows you through life on passports, diplomas, marriage licenses, gravestones. The medieval innovation that began as a tax collector's convenience has become fundamental to how you understand yourself. When someone asks, "What's your name?" you give 2 answers. Your personal name and your family name, one chosen for you, the other inherited from centuries of administrative necessity. Even modern debates about surnames, whether wives should take husbands' names, whether children should carry both parents' surnames, whether you can change your name entirely, are debates about the rules established in the medieval period, when surnames shifted from flexible descriptors to fixed legal identities. So when you sign your name, remember, that surname, that family marker, exists because medieval bureaucrats needed a way to track who owed taxes. What began as administrative expedients became heritage, identity, the name you carry into every room you enter. Medieval rules don't always feel like rules. Sometimes they feel like something you were born with. Section 5, color coding the classes. You probably choose your clothes based on personal preference, weather, occasion. You wear black to funerals because it's somber and respectful. You might avoid wearing white after Labor Day, though you're not entirely sure why. You understand intuitively that colors carry meaning, red for passion or danger, white for purity, blue for calm. But in the medieval period, color wasn't just symbolic. It was law. Sumptuary laws, regulations dictating who could wear what were common across medieval Europe. These laws specified not just styles of clothing, but colors, fabrics, and decorations, all carefully calibrated to reflect and enforce social hierarchy. You weren't free to wear whatever you liked. Your clothing announced your status, and wearing above your station was a punishable offense. Purple, for example, was royal. The dye came from murex snails, thousands of them crushed to produce a tiny amount of pigment, making purple cloth breathtakingly expensive. By law and custom, only royalty and the highest nobility could wear it. Seeing someone in purple immediately signaled supreme status. To wear it without authorization was to commit a kind of visual fraud, claiming a rank you didn't possess. Crimson and deep scarlet reds were also restricted, reserved for nobles and wealthy merchants who could afford the costly dyes. These reds came from kermes insects or, later, cochineal, both expensive and labor-intensive to produce. A bolt of crimson cloth could cost more than a laborer earned in a year. Sumptuary laws in England and France specified that only knights, barons, and above could wear these shades. Peasants and craftsmen were limited to cheaper, duller browns and grays, dyed with readily available plant materials, woad, madder, onion skins, tree bark. The gold cloth fabric woven with real gold thread was reserved for royalty and the highest church officials. Silver thread was similarly restricted. To see someone wearing gold was to know immediately that you stood before power. The glitter wasn't just decorative. It was a message. I am so far above you that I wear metal as cloth. These laws weren't arbitrary fashion rules. They served clear purposes. First, they made social hierarchy visible at a glance. In a society where most people couldn't read, visual signals mattered. You needed to instantly recognize a noble, a merchant, a peasant, a prostitute, a Jew. Clothing color and style provided that instant recognition, sorting people into categories before a word was spoken. Second, sumptuary laws controlled luxury spending. Nobles worried that wealthy merchants were becoming too powerful, too ostentatious. If a merchant could dress as richly as a duke, what did that say about the social order? Sumptuary laws kept the nouveau rich visually subordinate, even if their purses were fat. You could be wealthy, but you couldn't look as wealthy as your betters. Third, these laws protected domestic cloth industries. Some sumptuary regulations banned imported fabrics or required people to wear locally produced wool. This wasn't just economic policy. It was patriotism enforced through dress code. Enforcement varied. In theory, violators faced fines, confiscation of illegal garments, even public shaming. In practice, enforcement was inconsistent. Wealthy merchants routinely pushed boundaries, paying fines as a cost of doing business. Fashion-forward nobles sometimes bent rules, and enforcement officers often looked the other way if sufficiently bribed. But the laws existed, and the threat of punishment shaped behavior. The rules extended beyond color to fabric and trim. Silk was restricted. Fur types were regulated ermine and sable for the highest ranks, rabbit and lambskin for lower orders. The length of a man's gown, the width of a woman's sleeves, the amount of embroidery allowed, all specified by law. Even shoes were regulated. Some laws limited the length of pointed toes, which had become so exaggerated among fashionable nobles that they hindered walking. Jews and Muslims in Christian Europe were often required to wear specific colors or badges to identify their religion, yellow badges, or distinctive hats, making them immediately recognizable and socially marked. Prostitutes in some cities were required to wear specific colors or styles to distinguish them from respectable women, sometimes red, sometimes striped fabric, sometimes specific hood styles. These weren't choices. They were legal mandates, marking bodies as different, lesser, dangerous. The medieval color coding system also extended to mourning. Wearing black for grief became standardized, though earlier periods had seen white or dark brown used as well. Black was expensive. Good black dye was hard to produce, requiring multiple dye baths and skilled craftsmanship, so wearing deep black mourning clothes was itself a status signal. You grieved, yes, but you grieved expensively. Over time, as middle classes grew wealthier and dyes became more accessible, sumptuary laws became harder to enforce. By the Renaissance, They were widely ignored, and by the 18th century, they had largely disappeared. But their legacy persists. You still associate certain colors with certain occasions. You still dress appropriately for job interviews, weddings, funerals. You still understand that showing up to a black tie event in jeans is wrong. Not because it's illegal, but because it violates unwritten social codes. The link between clothing and status didn't vanish. It just became more subtle, more fluid, more about taste than law. And yet, look closely, and you'll see the old patterns. Luxury brands use color to signal exclusivity, Tiffany blue, Hermes orange. Corporate dress codes still exist, regulating what you can wear to work. School uniforms enforce sameness, erasing individual expression to create institutional identity. The rule that clothes make the man is a direct descendant of medieval sumptuary law. The idea that what you wear doesn't just reflect who you are, but determines how others treat you. The medieval world's obsession with color coding didn't fade, it adapted. You don't need a law to tell you that torn jeans and a hoodie mark you differently than a tailored suit. Society still judges by appearances, still sorts people visually. The palette has expanded, the rules have softened, but the principle remains. Color and cloth communicate status, and everyone who sees you reads that message, consciously or not. So, when you pull on black for a funeral or choose your outfit for a first date, you're participating in a system established centuries ago, when color wasn't personal preference but legal mandate. Medieval rules didn't need to stay on the books to stay powerful. They just needed to seep into culture deeply enough that you'd enforce them yourself, without anyone having to tell you why. Section 6. Bathroom Etiquette's Dirty Secrets. You wash your hands after using the restroom. You close the bathroom door. You don't discuss bodily functions at the dinner table. These norms feel universal, natural, obvious. But they're not timeless, they're cultural, and many trace back to medieval attempts to manage hygiene, privacy, and the uncomfortable realities of human waste in a world without plumbing. Medieval people weren't ignorant of cleanliness, but their standards and practices differed drastically from yours. One rule, however, has persisted with surprising consistency. The left hand is dirty, the right hand is clean. This division dates back to practicalities of pre-toilet paper life. In medieval Europe, as in much of the pre-modern world, people cleaned themselves after defecation with their left hand and water, or cloth, or leaves. The right hand was reserved for eating, greeting, handling food. This wasn't superstition. It was hygiene, keeping one hand exclusively for clean tasks and the other for unclean. Tasks reduced the risk of contaminating food with fecal matter. Islamic law codified this practice explicitly. The left hand was for istinja, cleaning after using the latrine. The right hand for eating and social interaction. To offer your left hand in greeting or to eat with it was deeply offensive, implying you were either ignorant of proper behavior or deliberately insulting your host. This rule was practical in origin, but became ritualized, carrying moral weight beyond its hygienic function. In medieval Christian Europe, the left-hand taboo was less formally codified, but still observed, especially among the educated and religious. Etiquette manuals from the later medieval period advised using the right hand for eating and the left for tasks like holding a drinking cup or steadying bread. The logic was similar. Keep one hand clean, one expendable. The division between left and right extended to other areas. When entering a church, you dipped your right hand in holy water, not your left. When making the sign of the cross, you used your right hand. The right hand was associated with blessing, the left with the profaning. This layered religious symbolism onto practical hygiene, reinforcing the idea that the left hand was inherently lesser. Hand washing wasn't as routine as it is today, but it wasn't absent either. Medieval feasts often included servants bringing water and towels for guests to wash their hands before eating. This wasn't about germ theory. The concept lay centuries in the future, but about visible cleanliness and courtesy. Dirty hands at the table were considered rude, a sign of low breeding. Latrines, where they existed, were basic. Castle garderobes were small rooms built into walls, with a wooden seat over a shaft that dropped waste into a moat, cesspit, or river below. Privacy was minimal. Some castles had communal latrines with multiple seats side by side. In towns, public latrines existed, but many people used chamber pots, emptying them into streets or cesspits. The smell was pervasive, accepted as unavoidable. Toilet paper, as we know it, didn't exist. Wealthy people might use soft cloths or wool, which could be washed and reused. Most people used whatever was available: straw, hay, leaves, corn cobs. The left hand remained the primary tool, with water for rinsing if available. This is why the left hand was dirty. It literally was. Bathing practices varied. Contrary to popular myth, medieval people bathed, though frequency depended on access to water and fuel. Public bathhouses existed in many cities, especially in the earlier medieval period, though they declined after the Black Death. Partly due to fears that bathhouses spread disease, and partly due to their association with prostitution. Private baths were luxuries of the wealthy. Most people washed their hands and faces regularly, but full-body baths were occasional events, not daily rituals. The concept of privacy around bodily functions was also evolving. In earlier periods, privacy was less valued, or perhaps less attainable. People slept communally, bathed communally, and often relieved themselves in view of others without shame. But as wealth increased and architecture allowed, private spaces emerged. By the later medieval period, wealthier homes had private chambers, and the idea that bodily functions should be hidden was taking root. The modern bathroom, a private room dedicated solely to washing and waste elimination, didn't exist in the medieval period. These functions happened in different places. You washed in your chamber from a basin. You relieved yourself in a garderobe or chamber pot. You bathed in a wooden tub brought to your room and filled with heated water by servants. The integration of these functions into a single room came much later, in the 19th century, with indoor plumbing. Still, the medieval period established patterns that persist. The idea that the bathroom is a private space where you close the door. The understanding that you wash your hands after using the toilet. The discomfort around discussing bodily waste openly. These aren't biological imperatives. Many cultures throughout history have had different standards, but they're deeply ingrained in Western culture. And they trace back to medieval attempts to manage hygiene in a world where disease was poorly understood but viscerally feared. You also inherited the left-hand rule, though you probably don't think of it that way. In most Western cultures, you eat and shake hands with your right hand. If you're left-handed, you may have faced subtle pressure to conform in certain contexts, using your right hand for greetings, even if it feels awkward, for instance. And in many parts of the world where the medieval Islamic or pre-modern hygiene rules never faded, the left-hand taboo remains strong and explicit. Even toilet paper, that modern convenience, reinforces the pattern. You use your right hand to tear and wipe, if you're right-handed, maintaining the centuries-old division. Bidets, common in many parts of the world, continue the water-washing tradition that predates paper entirely. So when you automatically close the bathroom door or wash your hands without thinking, you're following rules established long ago, when keeping waste separate from food wasn't just polite, it was survival. The medieval world's bathroom etiquette wasn't written in stone, but it was written in habit, in disgust, in the daily negotiations of bodies that had to eat and excrete without making each other sick. And those habits, refined over centuries, became the invisible rules you live by today. Medieval customs didn't vanish. They became so automatic that you forgot they were customs at all. They became hygiene, decency, civilization itself. And you enforce them without question, because a world without those rules feels not just wrong, but dirty. Section 7. The 7-day week's sacred rhythm. You divide your life into weeks. 7 days, repeating endlessly. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. Workdays and weekends. The rhythm is so natural you might assume it's universal, even biological. It's not. The 7-day week is a cultural construct, and its dominance in the Western world owes everything to medieval Christianity's successful imposition of sacred time onto daily life. Ancient civilizations had various week lengths. The Babylonians observed a 7-day cycle tied to lunar phases. The Egyptians used a 10-day week. The Romans used an 8-day market cycle. But the 7-day week as we know it, with Sunday as a day of rest and religious observance, spread through Christian Europe during the medieval period and became legally mandated, spiritually enforced, and economically embedded. The Christian Sunday emerged from Jewish Sabbath traditions, but shifted from Saturday to Sunday to commemorate Christ's resurrection. Early Christians gathered on Sunday for worship, and as Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, Sunday slowly became a recognized day of rest. But it wasn't until the medieval period that Sunday rest became legally enforced across Europe. Medieval laws required cessation of labor on Sundays and major feast days. You couldn't plow fields, conduct business, hold markets, or engage in most forms of work. Attending church was mandatory. Missing Sunday Mass could result in fines, public penance, or social ostracism. The church's control over time was nearly total. It defined when you rested, when you prayed, when you labored. This created the foundational rhythm of the week. 6 days of work, 1 day of rest. The pattern appears in the biblical creation story. God created the world in 6 days and rested on the 7th. And the medieval church made sure everyone lived by that pattern. Sunday became sacred, set apart, protected by law and custom. The other days of the week also carried Christian meaning. Their names in English actually preserve pre-Christian Germanic gods: Monday, Moonsday, Tuesday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Woden's Day, Thursday, Thor's Day, Friday, Freya's Day, Saturday, Saturn's Day. But medieval Christianity overlaid these with saints' feast days and liturgical observances. The church calendar, dense with holy days, structured the week, the month, the year. Feast days multiplied. In addition to Sundays, the medieval calendar included dozens of holy days when work was forbidden and church attendance required. Christmas, Easter, Pentecost, All Saints, feast days for local saints, rogation days. By some estimates, medieval workers observed 60 to 80 days of rest per year, far more than most modern workers enjoy. But these weren't vacation days. They were religious obligations spent in church, not leisure. The church's control over time extended beyond days to hours. Monastic communities structured their days around the divine office. A cycle of prayers set at specific times: matins, midnight, lauds, dawn; prime, early morning; terce, mid-morning; sext, noon; none, mid-afternoon; vespers, evening; compline, night. These weren't optional. Monks rose in darkness to pray, interrupted labor to pray, ended their days in prayer. The bells that marked these hours rang across towns and villages, regulating not just monastic life, but the broader community's sense of time. This created the idea of clock time before mechanical clocks existed. Church bells told you when to wake, when to eat, when to work, when to stop. Time wasn't measured in precise minutes, but in prayers, liturgies, the rhythm of bells. This religious structuring of time shaped labor patterns. You worked until the bell rang for sext, rested briefly, resumed until vespers. When mechanical clocks began appearing in European towns during the late medieval period, first on church towers, then on town halls, they didn't replace religious time. They reinforced it. Clock faces often showed saints' feast days and liturgical seasons alongside hours. Time remained sacred, even as it became measurable. The enforcement of Sunday rest wasn't purely spiritual. It served economic and social functions too. Mandating rest 1 day per week prevented lords from working peasants to death 7 days straight. It guaranteed time for community gathering, market socializing, matchmaking, dispute resolution, all the informal social maintenance that keeps societies functioning. The church positioned itself as protector of workers' rest, even as it demanded that rest be spent in worship. This pattern persisted beyond the medieval period. Protestant Reformation leaders like Calvin and Luther maintained strict Sabbath observance, sometimes even more rigidly than medieval Catholics. Blue laws, regulations prohibiting commerce on Sundays remained common in Europe and America into the 20th century. Until quite recently, stores closed on Sundays, bars couldn't serve alcohol, and even recreational activities were restricted. Today, the 7-day week is global, adopted even by cultures that historically used different systems. The names vary in Romance languages. Days reference Christian concepts. Domingo Dimanche for Sunday, meaning Lord's Day, but the structure is universal. And even in increasingly secular societies, the weekend persists. You still think of Saturday and Sunday as days off, even if you don't attend church. You still plan your life in weeks, anticipating Friday, dreading Monday. You still feel that Sunday has a different quality, quieter, slower, even if you're not sure why. This is the ghost of medieval sacred time, still structuring your experience even as its religious content fades. The modern work week, Monday through Friday, with Saturday and Sunday off, is a direct descendant of medieval Christian time discipline. The 19th century labor movement fought for the weekend, but the concept was already there, embedded in centuries of Christian practice. Workers demanded what medieval peasants had already possessed: the right to rest on the seventh day. Even the concept of the work-life balance assumes this weekly structure. You work 5 days, rest 2. The ratio varies. Some cultures or jobs blur the boundaries, but the underlying pattern remains. The week, that 7-day cycle, has become so naturalized that imagining any other division of time feels bizarre. So when you look forward to the weekend or dread Monday morning, you're living inside a time system created by medieval Christianity, one that divided labor from rest, sacred from profane, work from worship. The 7-day week isn't natural law, it's a medieval rule that became so successful, so embedded, that it conquered the calendar itself. And now you live by it without question, your life pulsing to a rhythm set by church bells that rang centuries ago. Section 8. Tipping's medieval hospitality. You tip your server at a restaurant. You leave $1 for the barista. You add 20% to the taxi fare. You do this automatically, understanding that tipping is expected, even required, in certain service contexts. But tipping isn't universal. Many countries don't practice it, and its origins are tangled, reaching back through centuries of European hospitality customs, class hierarchies, and the uneasy relationship between service and payment. One possible origin of tipping lies in medieval hospitality traditions, particularly the practice of veils. When a guest stayed at a manor or noble household, they were expected to leave small gratuities for the servants who attended them, the grooms who cared for their horses, the maids who prepared their rooms, the cooks who made their meals. These payments, called veils, weren't salaries. They were personal thank yous, acknowledging service rendered. Veils served several functions. They supplemented servants' meager wages, which were often barely enough to survive on. They incentivized good service servants, who were attentive and discreet, received larger veils. And they reinforced social hierarchy. The guest, by distributing veils, demonstrated their own wealth and generosity, while servants acknowledged their dependence on the generosity of their betters. The term tip, as a shorthand for a gratuity, has murky etymology. One popular but likely apocryphal story claims it stands for to ensure promptness, supposedly posted on boxes in English coffee houses where patrons deposited coins for better service. This is almost certainly a backronym, a false etymology invented to explain an existing word. The actual origin of tip probably relates to tipping or giving, but its exact path into English is unclear. What is clear is that by the early modern period, tipping had become codified in European service culture. When travelers stayed at inns, they tipped the servants. When nobles dined at others' homes, they left money for the staff. This wasn't charity, it was expectation, almost obligation. To leave without tipping marked you as cheap, rude, or ignorant of proper conduct. The practice created resentment, both from those who gave and those who received. Guests found the expectation burdensome, especially when traveling frequently. Every stage of a journey required tips, and the costs added up. Servants, meanwhile, depended on tips to survive, but had no guarantee of receiving them. Their livelihoods rested on the whims and generosity of strangers, making their income unpredictable. When tipping culture crossed the Atlantic to America in the 19th century, it faced resistance. Some Americans saw it as European elitism, incompatible with democratic ideals. Why should workers depend on tips instead of earning fair wages? Several states briefly banned tipping in the early 20th century, but the laws were rarely enforced and eventually repealed. Tipping persisted, especially in industries, restaurants, hotels, personal services, where labor was cheap and often performed by marginalized groups. The medieval connection lies not in a direct line of practice, but in the underlying logic. Service workers are underpaid, and customers are expected to supplement their income directly. In medieval manners, servants' wages were low because employers assumed veils would make up the difference. In modern American restaurants, servers' wages are low because employers assume tips will compensate. The structure is strikingly similar, even if the centuries between have changed the names and contexts. Tipping also reflects medieval attitudes about generosity and status. In medieval thought, charity and generosity were virtues expected of the wealthy. Giving alms to the poor, leaving veils for servants, providing hospitality. These acts demonstrated not just wealth, but moral character. The generous lord was a good lord, the stingy one, despicable. Tipping today carries echoes of this. Leaving a large tip feels virtuous, generous, a sign that you're not just wealthy but decent. Stiffing a server feels shameful, mean-spirited, a mark of bad character. But tipping also reinforces inequality. In medieval households, servants were entirely dependent on their master's goodwill and guests' generosity. They had no leverage, no power to demand better wages or conditions. Today's tipped workers face similar precarity. They can't refuse service or demand fair pay without risking their income. The tip, ostensibly voluntary, functions as a required subsidy for employers who underpay their workers. Debates about tipping are debates about fairness, dignity, and the relationship between service and compensation. Some argue tipping should be abolished, replaced by higher wages and higher prices. Others defend it as rewarding good service and giving workers more control over their earnings. Both sides, knowingly or not, are arguing about a system whose roots reach back to medieval hospitality, where the line between gift and obligation was always blurry, and servant survival depended on navigating that ambiguity with grace. When you calculate 20% on your restaurant bill or round up the taxi fare, you're performing a ritual shaped by centuries of European class dynamics. You're acknowledging service, demonstrating generosity, following a rule that's not law, but feels like duty. And the server who smiles and thanks you is performing their own part of the same old script, one written long ago in manor halls and coaching inns, where the powerful gave, the powerless received, and everyone pretended it was all voluntary. Medieval rules about tipping didn't travel forward unchanged. They evolved, adapted, crossed oceans and centuries. But the basic pattern persists. Service is underpaid. Customers are expected to compensate, and your generosity, or lack thereof, marks you as a certain kind of person. The medieval world didn't invent inequality, but it did invent some very durable ways of managing it. And you're still living inside them, one tip at a time. Section 9 time by the bell. You check your phone. 9:47 a.m. You have a meeting at 10 o'clock. You rush. Time is precise, measured, inescapable. Your day is divided into hours, minutes, seconds. You schedule your life down to the quarter hour, coordinating with others who also live by the clock. This experience of time exact, quantified, externally enforced, feels natural, but it's not. It's a medieval invention, and it began with bells. Before mechanical clocks, time was fluid. Daylight hours were longer in summer, shorter in winter. Morning meant sunrise, evening meant sunset. The day was divided loosely by the sun's position, by hunger, by the needs of animals and crops. Most people had no way to measure precise time, and no particular need to. You woke with light, worked until dark, slept when tired. But medieval monasteries required precision. Monks and nuns were bound by the divine office, a cycle of prayers to be performed at specific times throughout the day and night. Missing an office was a failure of discipline, a sin. But without clocks, how did monastic communities coordinate hundreds of people to pray at the same moment? The answer was bells. Large bells, mounted in towers, rung by hand to mark the hours of prayer. The sound carried across monastery grounds into surrounding towns, announcing sacred time. Matins at midnight, lauds at dawn, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, compline, each marked by bells. Monks woke, worked, ate, and slept by these bells, their lives structured by sound. This was revolutionary. For the first time in Western Europe since the Roman era, time was being measured and publicly announced. And because monastic bells rang loudly enough to be heard in nearby villages and towns, lay people also began organizing their days by these sounds. The bells told you when to start work, when to break for midday meal, when to stop for evening. Time was no longer just personal or natural. It was communal, regulated, external. As towns grew in the later medieval period, civic authorities adopted the bell system. Town halls and cathedrals mounted bells that rang to announce markets, curfews, emergencies. Guild bells called workers to their trades. Church bells marked the canonical hours even for those who didn't attend every service. The soundscape of the medieval town was dominated by bells, each one communicating information. Time to work, time to rest, time to pray, time to take shelter, time to gather. Bells created what scholars call time discipline, the sense that time is a resource to be managed, allocated, measured. When the bell rang, you stopped what you were doing and shifted to the next task. You learned to anticipate the bells, to plan your day around them, to feel anxiety when a bell approached and you weren't prepared. Time became something you could be late for, something you could waste, something external to your own experience. This was reinforced by the development of mechanical clocks in the 14th century, first in monasteries, then in wealthy towns. Early mechanical clocks were massive, expensive, and not particularly accurate. But they had one key advantage. They rang bells automatically, on schedule, without human intervention. You could rely on them. They divided the day into equal hours, regardless of season, creating a standardized, predictable time that everyone could synchronize to. The clock faces themselves were often elaborate, decorated with astrological symbols, saints' feast days, zodiac signs. But their most important feature was the hourly chime. Even if you couldn't see the clock face, you could hear it. Time was announced, proclaimed, impossible to ignore. This system shaped labor. Medieval guilds and workshops began organizing work into shifts marked by bells. You arrived when the bell rang. You left when it rang again. Lateness was punishable. Time wasting was theft, not just from your employer but from God, who had given you this day to use productively. The moral weight of punctuality was reinforced from pulpits and guild regulations alike. By the later medieval period, the day was divided into measurable segments, and people were expected to account for their time. This mindset laid the groundwork for modern capitalism, which depends on precise timekeeping to coordinate production, trade, and labor. The 9 to -5 workday, the punch clock, the time shift, all descendants of medieval bell-rung time discipline. Even the concept of being on time is medieval. Before bells and clocks, you were simply early or late relative to the sun or to other people's presence. But once time was externalized, measured, and announced, you could be objectively late. The bell had rung. You weren't there. You had failed. Today, you live in a world saturated with timekeeping devices. Your phone, your computer, the clock on the microwave, the timestamp on every email. Time is so precisely measured that you can coordinate a video call with someone on another continent down to the second. This level of precision would have been unimaginable to medieval people, but the underlying principle time as external, measurable, and disciplinary was born in their monastery towers. And you still respond to bells, or their modern equivalents. Your alarm jolts you awake. Your phone buzzes with calendar reminders. Chimes mark the hour. These sounds structure your day, just as the monastery bells structured medieval monks' days. You've internalized time discipline so deeply that you feel anxiety when running late, guilt when wasting time, satisfaction when you use your time well. The medieval innovation wasn't just the clock. It was the idea that time should be public, measurable, and enforced. That your day shouldn't flow naturally, but should be divided into segments, each with its purpose. That being late is a moral failure, not just an inconvenience. These ideas, born in the rhythms of medieval monastic prayer, now govern your entire life. So when your alarm rings at 7 a.m. and you groan, you're experiencing a rule established centuries ago by monks who decided that God required precision, and that bells were the way to achieve it. Time by the bell became time by the clock, became time by the smartphone. The technology changed. The discipline didn't. And now you live inside a structure built by medieval Christianity. One ring, 1 hour, one scheduled meeting at a time. Section 10, Night Rules. Darkness and danger. You don't think much about going out at night. You leave your house after dark, walk down streets, drive across town. Night is inconvenient, darker, colder, but not fundamentally different from day. But for most of human history, night was dangerous. And medieval Europe developed strict rules to manage that danger. Rules that shaped how people moved, gathered, and lived after sunset. Medieval towns and cities had curfews. The word curfew itself comes from the French couvre-feu, meaning cover fire. At a designated evening hour, marked by a bell, residents were required to extinguish or bank their fires and candles, close their shutters, and stay indoors. Anyone found on the streets after curfew without legitimate reason faced questioning, fines, or arrest. Curfews served multiple purposes. Fire was a constant threat in medieval towns, where wooden buildings crowded together, thatch roofs touched, and open flames provided heat and light. A single unattended candle could ignite a house, a block, an entire district. Curfews reduced fire risk by ensuring fires were controlled before people slept. But curfews also addressed crime and disorder. Darkness provided cover for theft, assault, and other illicit activities. Drunken brawls erupted in taverns and spilled in streets. Strangers moved through town unrecognized. Curfews cleared the streets, making any nighttime movement suspicious. If you were caught out after curfew, you better have a good reason tending a berth, carrying a message, responding to an emergency, or you'd be hauled before authorities. Enforcement relied on night watchmen, town guards who patrolled streets, checked for lights in windows, challenged anyone abroad after hours. Their cry, "Who goes there?" became ritualized, part of the nighttime soundscape. Watchmen carried lanterns, bells, and weapons. They weren't police in the modern sense. They were more like community enforcers, often unpaid volunteers rotating through the duty, sometimes paid town employees. Lanterns and torches were regulated too. Carrying a light at night marked you as legitimate, a person with business, not a criminal. Some towns required anyone moving after dark to carry a lantern, making them visible to watchmen. Others regulated torch materials to prevent fires. Lanterns themselves became symbols of lawful nighttime activity. Taverns faced restrictions. Many towns limited tavern hours, requiring them to close at or before curfew. Alehouses that stayed open late risked fines or closure. This wasn't just morality policing. It was practical drunken patrons stumbling home in darkness caused disturbances, fights, accidents. Better to close early and send everyone home while some light remained. Nighttime also carried spiritual weight. Darkness was associated with evil, demons, restless spirits. Prayers before sleep weren't just habit, they were protection. Church bells rung at dusk served to drive away malevolent forces as much as to mark time. The night was when the devil prowled, when witches met, when the dead walked. These beliefs reinforced curfew rules. Good Christians stayed indoors, protected by walls, crosses, prayers. Those abroad in darkness invited suspicion of not just criminal but spiritual corruption. These fears weren't entirely irrational. Nighttime injuries were common. People fell into ditches, walked off piers, stumbled on uneven streets. Without streetlights, navigation was difficult and dangerous. Wolves and other predators sometimes entered towns at night. Robbers knew travelers on dark roads were vulnerable. The night was genuinely more dangerous, and rules developed to manage that reality. The legacy of medieval curfews persists. Modern curfews for minors during emergencies in certain neighborhoods echo the medieval logic. Darkness increases danger, and restricting movement reduces risk. The idea that respectable people should be home at certain hours lingers, especially regarding young people. Parents set curfews, cities enforce them. The assumption remains: nighttime freedom requires justification. Streetlights, when they eventually appeared, fundamentally changed nighttime life. Gas lamps in the 18th century, electric lights in the 19th and 20th, transformed cities from places that shut down at dusk into 24-hour environments. Night ceased to be a barrier to activity, but even now, well-lit streets signal safety, while dark alleys signal danger. Light and darkness still carry the medieval associations. Illumination equals order, shadow equals threat. Your own nighttime behavior reflects these ancient patterns. You lock your doors at night, even if you don't during the day. You're more alert, more cautious after dark. You avoid poorly lit areas. You teach children not to go out alone at night. These aren't laws, exactly, but they're rules, internalized and widely shared. Descendants of medieval curfews and nighttime regulations. And when emergency curfews are imposed during riots, natural disasters, pandemics, the mechanism is the same as it was in medieval towns. A bell or siren or broadcast, an announced time, a requirement to stay indoors, patrols to enforce compliance. The specifics change. The structure doesn't. Medieval night rules weren't just about control, though control was part of it. They were about managing genuine danger in a world without electric light, emergency services, or easy communication. They created order from darkness, safety from shadow. And while you no longer hear curfew bells or fear wolves in the streets, you still navigate night with caution, still treat darkness as a space requiring different rules. The medieval understanding of night as a time set apart, governed by different expectations, hasn't vanished. It just wears modern clothes and carries a flashlight. Section 11: Classroom Structures. Medieval roots. You sit in rows, facing forward. The teacher stands at the front. You raise your hand to speak. You take notes. You complete homework. You're tested, graded, ranked. This structure feels inevitable, the only way education could work. But it's not. It's a specific model, and its roots reach back to medieval Europe's cathedral schools and universities, where the modern classroom was invented. In the early medieval period, education was mostly informal or monastic. Children learned trades from parents, manners from community, prayers from priests. Formal schooling was rare, reserved for boys training for the clergy. Monasteries taught Latin, scripture, liturgy skills needed for religious life. But by the 12th and 13th centuries, Europe's first universities emerged in Bologna, Paris, Oxford, and other cities. These weren't universities as you know them. No campuses, no dorms, no athletics. They were loose associations of masters and students. gathering in rented halls, churches, even taverns to study theology, law, medicine, and the liberal arts. The teaching method was the lecture. A master read from an authoritative text, Aristotle, the Bible, Roman law, and provided commentary. Students listened, memorized, occasionally asked questions. The master held the knowledge. Students received it. This hierarchical structure, teacher as authority and students as subordinates, became the foundation of Western education. The physical arrangement reinforced this. Students sat facing the master, who stood or sat at a raised lectern. This wasn't just practical, it was symbolic. The master occupied a position of height and prominence, literally and figuratively above the students. To speak, students sought permission. Interruption was rude, punishable. The flow of information was one way, from authority to learner. Discipline was strict. Medieval teachers wielded rods, canes, and birches freely. Students who failed to memorize, spoke out of turn, or misbehaved were struck. This was considered not just acceptable, but necessary. Spare the rod, spoil the child. Pain enforced learning, or at least obedience. The goal wasn't just to educate, but to shape character, instill humility, break youthful pride. Homework, in a sense, existed too. Students were expected to memorize texts, practice recitation, copy manuscripts. Learning was largely rote-repeat until you've internalized it. Original thought was less valued than mastery of established knowledge. You prove your learning by accurately reproducing what you've been taught, not by questioning it. Examinations tested this mastery. Oral examinations, where students recited or debated, were common. Written exams came later. The point was to demonstrate that you had absorbed the curriculum, that you could repeat, explain, apply the teachings of the ancients and the church. Success earned you a degree, literally a step upward in academic rank, an entry into the Guild of Scholars. This model spread. As literacy increased and printing made books more available, schools multiplied. Cathedral schools, grammar schools, parish schools all adopted the lecture format. The hierarchical seating, the discipline, the homework, the exams. By the early modern period, this structure was standard across Europe. The Industrial Revolution intensified it. Mass education systems needed efficiency. Factory schools, designed to train large numbers of workers, adopted the medieval classroom wholesale. Rows of desks, standardized curriculum, timed lessons, grades. Education became production. Students the products, teachers the foremen. But the underlying structure, teacher as authority, students as recipients, obedience as prerequisite for learning, was medieval. Today, you still sit in rows. The teacher, or professor, still stands at the front. You still raise your hand, complete homework, take tests. Variations exist: Socratic seminars, group work, flipped classrooms, but the default remains the medieval lecture model. Authority flows from the front of the room. Knowledge is transmitted, received, tested. Even online education replicates this structure. Video lectures mimic the master reading from a lectern. Discussion boards require permission, implicit in the forum format. Homework and exams remain. The technology changes. The hierarchy doesn't. Critics argue this model is outdated, designed for passive reception rather than active learning, for obedience rather than creativity. Alternative models exist: Montessori, project-based learning, democratic schools, but they remain alternatives, deviations from a norm established centuries ago. The persistence of the medieval classroom reflects deeper assumptions: that learning requires authority, that knowledge is something transferred from expert to novice, that students need structure and discipline to learn. These assumptions aren't universally true, but they're deeply rooted. They feel like common sense because they've been practiced for so long. So when you walk into a classroom, take your seat, face the front, and wait for the teacher to begin. You're enacting a script written in medieval Paris and Bologna, refined in Reformation-era grammar schools, industrialized in 19th century factories, and delivered now via Zoom. The setting changes. The structure endures. Medieval rules don't need to be written down to govern your behavior. Sometimes they just need to be built into the rooms you sit in, the roles you play, the habits you never think to question. Section 12 Cleanliness Rituals we inherited. You shower daily. You brush your teeth. You change your sheets weekly. You wash your hands before meals. These practices feel instinctive, biological, universal. They're not. They're cultural rituals, and many trace back to medieval Europe's attempts to manage hygiene, morality, and the visible boundaries between clean and unclean. Medieval people weren't as dirty as stereotypes suggest, but their standards differed from yours. Water was suspect. Physicians warned that bathing opened the pores to disease. The Black Death reinforced this fear. Some blamed bathhouses for spreading plague. Full-body bathing declined in frequency, especially after the 14th century. Washing hands and face remained common, but immersing the whole body became less frequent, sometimes reserved for major life events. Marriage, serious illness, annual spring cleaning. But cleanliness wasn't just physical, it was moral. The medieval church taught that bodily purity reflected spiritual purity. Monks and nuns observed strict washing rituals before Mass, symbolically cleansing themselves to approach the sacred. Pilgrims ritually bathed before entering holy sites. Brides bathed before weddings. These weren't just hygienic acts. They were sacramental, marking transitions from profane to sacred states. Linen played a key role. Medieval people wore linen on the garments next to their skin, believing that linen absorbed sweat, dirt, and bodily impurities. Changing your shirt was cleaning yourself. The more often you changed linen, the cleaner you were. Wealthy people changed shirts daily. Poorer people less often. But the principle held. Fresh linen meant cleanliness, even if you didn't bathe. This belief persists. You change your underwear daily. You change your sheets regularly. You launder clothes after wearing them once or twice. These practices aren't medically necessary. You could wear the same underwear for days without health consequences. Technically, but they feel necessary because you've internalized the medieval and later Victorian belief that cloth absorbs pollution, that fresh fabric equals cleanliness. Hair care carried moral weight too. Unkempt hair signaled poverty, madness, or sin. Monks shaved their heads, tonsures, as symbols of renunciation. Women covered their hair in public. Uncovered hair suggested immodesty, availability, even witchcraft. Hair was potent, dangerous, requiring control. Brushing, braiding, covering, these weren't vanity. They were moral acts, taming a wild part of the body. Today, you still manage your hair obsessively. You wash it, style it, cut it regularly. Bedhead embarrasses you. Professional environments demand neat hair. The specifics have changed. Women no longer cover their hair in most Western contexts. But the idea that hair requires constant management, that unkempt hair signals disorder or negligence, persists. Teeth cleaning rituals also have medieval roots. People used twigs, cloth, and abrasive powders to scrub teeth. Bad breath was socially unacceptable, associated with decay, illness, moral failing. Chewing herbs meant parsley freshened breath. While medieval people didn't understand bacteria or cavities as you do, they recognized that mouth cleanliness affected social interaction. Clean mouth, pleasant breath, social acceptance. Your toothbrush, toothpaste, floss, mouthwash, these are technological improvements on medieval practices, but the underlying ritual is the same. Clean your mouth daily. Present yourself as hygienic. Avoid the social penalty of bad breath. You inherited a medieval rule. Oral cleanliness is non-negotiable. The weekly cycle of cleaning also has medieval origins. Sunday, as a day of rest, became associated with domestic cleaning and personal grooming. Saturday evening or Sunday morning, you prepared yourself for church, washed, changed into clean clothes, tidied your home. This rhythm cleaning before the holy day structured the week. By the 19th century, spring cleaning became ritualized. an annual deep clean that echoed medieval pre-Easter cleansing rituals. You still clean on weekends, change sheets on Sundays, feel vaguely guilty if the house is messy before guests arrive. The religious context has faded, but the rhythm remains. Regular cleaning cycles. Guilt when you fall behind. Satisfaction when you're caught up. These patterns aren't natural. They're cultural. Inherited from centuries of moral and spiritual weight placed on visible cleanliness. Medieval attitudes also distinguish between visible and invisible dirt. Dirty hands were shameful. Unseen filth less so. Washing hands before eating was crucial. They touched food, and food entered your body. But washing your back? Less urgent. This focus on visible, socially relevant cleanliness persists. You wash your hands obsessively, your face daily, but you might skip a shower if you're not seeing anyone. The logic is the same. Cleanliness is about social presentation as much as hygiene. The connection between cleanliness and morality also endures. Cleanliness is next to godliness is a later proverb, but the sentiment is medieval. Dirty people are suspect lazy, irresponsible, possibly dangerous. Clean people are trustworthy, respectable, upright. This isn't medically sound. You can be clean and immoral, dirty and virtuous, but the association is culturally powerful. Job interviews, first dates, court appearances all require visible cleanliness. You shower, groom, wear clean clothes, because failure to do so signals something deeply wrong. Not just poor hygiene, but poor character. The medieval equation of bodily purity with moral purity, though secularized, still operates. Even the language of cleaning carries moral weight. You clean up your act. You have a clean slate. You want a clean conscience. Dirt, filth, stain all metaphors for sin, guilt, corruption. Purity, cleanliness, spotlessness, all metaphors for innocence, virtue, righteousness. These linguistic patterns reflect centuries of Christian teaching that treated physical and spiritual cleanliness as intertwined. So when you step into the shower, brush your teeth, change your sheets, you're not just maintaining hygiene. You're performing rituals that mark you as civilized, moral, socially acceptable. You're following rules established long ago, when bodily cleanliness was a public statement about your soul's condition. The theology has faded, but the compulsion remains. You clean yourself because medieval rules, absorbed into culture, transformed hygiene into morality, and morality into habit. And now, standing under hot water, scrubbing away the day's dirt, you probably don't think about monks washing their hands before Mass, or medieval brides bathing before their weddings, or peasants changing linen shirts to feel clean. But they're there in the ritual, and the guilt you feel when you skip a shower, and the satisfaction of fresh sheets. Medieval rules about cleanliness didn't vanish. They became so normal, so automatic, that you mistake them for nature itself. And every morning, you wake and enforce them again. Section 13 closing. The weight of invisible rules you've drifted through centuries tonight. Watching how medieval customs became modern reflexes. You've seen how the left-hand shadow still falls across handshakes. How church bells evolved into alarm clocks. How color-coded clothing became unspoken dress codes. None of these rules announce themselves. They don't come with explanations or disclaimers. They're just there, woven so tightly into daily life that you never thought to question them. That's how the most powerful rules work. Not through force, but through familiarity. Not through command, but through repetition across so many generations that they feel like truth instead of tradition. You shake with your right hand because that's what people do. You wait your turn in line because cutting feels wrong in your gut. You wear black to funerals because any other color would feel disrespectful, and you couldn't quite explain why. The medieval world didn't need to leave behind laws or proclamations to shape your life. It just needed to make its patterns normal, to embed its assumptions so deeply that centuries later, you'd still follow them without knowing their names or origins. You're living inside history, not beside it. Every time you check the time, stand in line, choose which hand to extend, you're speaking a language written long ago in monastery bells and manor halls and market squares. Some of these rules serve you well. Organization, hygiene, courtesy, these aren't inherently bad just because they're old. But some rules carry old prejudices in their bones. The left hand's lingering stigma, the assumption that certain colors signal certain things, the idea that some people's time matters more than others. These two are medieval inheritances, and perhaps those are worth noticing, worth questioning, worth deciding whether to carry forward or finally set down. The past doesn't stay in the past. It breathes in your routines, in the words you speak, in the instincts you trust. Tonight you've seen some of its fingerprints. Tomorrow, you'll see more if you look. And maybe, just maybe, you'll start to wonder which other rules you follow, automatic, invisible, ancient, are still waiting to be noticed. So rest now. Let the old world's whispers fade into sleep. Let the customs drift and settle. And remember, every habit has a history. Every rule, even the ones that feel like common sense, was invented by someone, somewhere, someone. And you, inheriting them, get to decide which ones still serve the world you want to live in. And which ones, after all these centuries, might finally be ready to change. If this kind of storytelling helped you rest, consider subscribing and letting me know in the comments where you're listening from. Until next time, sleep well and let history do its quiet work.